The soft yellow light from the bedside lamp cast faint streaks across the ceiling, threading through the shadows in the room. The steady patter of rain on the roof worked to soothe the oppressive silence. But it couldn't muffle the rapid thudding of Evelyn Parker's heartbeat. She stood in the center of her studio, her eyes fixed on the unfinished portrait before her, the paintbrush trembling in her hand. It was a portrait of a man. His face was incomplete and blurred and waiting for its final touches, but the eyes, those were meticulously detailed, alive in a way that seemed to pierce through the soul of anyone who dared to meet their gaze. Evelyn swallowed hard, the weight of unease pressing against her chest like a heavy stone. She didn't know why she had painted those eyes. Yet she recognized them instantly. They were the eyes she had seen in a fleeting, haunting moment when Lucas Brooks first stepped into her house. The sound of footsteps behind her made her startle and spin around. The studio door creaked open. And there he was, leaning casually against the frame. His gaze was calm and steady. But there was a sharpness in his eyes that she couldn't quite define. "I didn't know you liked painting portraits," he said, his voice deep and smooth, resonating in the stillness of the room. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She steadied herself, setting the brush down on the palette and turning away, avoiding his gaze. "It's just one of the many projects I'm working on it," she replied, her voice rougher than she intended. Lucas stepped inside without hesitation. He stopped in front of the painting, his eyes sweeping over every detail of the incomplete face. These eyes, he tilted his head, a faint smile playing at his lips. They seemed familiar. A shiver went down Evelyn's spine as she said, "Just an idea." Her tone betrayed the tension she was trying to hide. And Lucas turned to face her, his gaze probing as though he could see through her thin veil. "Words are just an idea," he said, raising an eyebrow. His disbelief was palpable, and the room felt frozen in time. Evelyn was eager to leave, but before she could do so, Lucas spoke again. His voice was slow and deliberate, and he had an unsettling authority. "You know," he paused, his smile weak but disarming, "and I typically remember the eyes of individuals I've met. These eyes are mine, aren't they?" His words rippled through the air, a wave crashing through Evelyn's fragile defenses. She stood rooted in place, her heart pounding so fiercely she could hear it echo in her ears. Outside, a clap of thunder roared, followed by a streak of lightning that illuminated the room through the window, emphasizing the charged atmosphere. Evelyn turned, her gaze locking with his. In a moment she could no longer evade Lucas. She murmured his name, but it wasn't a reproach. It was an acknowledgement, and UNSP spoken truth she wasn't ready to confront. But in his eyes she saw no judgment, no condemnation. There was only patience and something deeper. Something she dared not name. And in that instant, Evelyn knew that everything in her life was about to change forever. Evelyn stood by the living room window, her gaze fixed on the garden behind the house. The gentle breeze stirred the leaves ever so slightly, but inside her, everything churned like a storm waiting to break. Outside, Skyla sat on the patio laughing animatedly with Lucas. Their voices, light and carefree, filled the air as if nothing in the world could sever the connection between them. Evelyn should have felt joy seeing her daughter so happy. But instead a dull ache pulsed within her, a feeling she couldn't quite name, but one she couldn't ignore. Lucas's silhouette in the garden was like a fragment of her past, pulling Evelyn back to a time when she was still young and full of hope. Back then she had believed that love and marriage would be the bedrock of her life. But what she found instead were broken promises and wounds that never healed. Evelyn had married Richard Parker in her early 20s. A man who appeared charming and polished on the outside but hid a tempest of control and oppression beneath his polished demeanor. In the early days of their marriage, Richard was like sunlight warming every shadowed corner of her heart, but that light soon turned into a consuming blaze that left nothing untouched. Richard demanded perfection in everything from the meals on the table to the way Evelyn carried herself at family gatherings. He never stopped criticizing, molding her into an image of the wife he thought she should be rather than accepting her for who she truly was. Evelyn had told herself she could endure it for love's sake, for Skylar's sake, their baby girl born just as their marriage began to teeter on the edge. But eventually everything shattered on a cold winter afternoon. Evelyn could still remember it vividly, Richard storming into her studio yelling because of a painting she had left unfinished. It wasn't for an exhibition or for sale. It was just for her, a quiet corner where she could still be herself. He ripped the painting to shreds right before her eyes, declaring that her art was worthless. Evelyn didn't cry, But that was the moment she realized she had lost herself completely in the confines of their marriage. A week later, she packed her things, took Skylar, and left the house she had once thought would be their forever home. Life after that was anything but easy. Evelyn worked tirelessly to raise her daughter, scraping together a living while rediscovering herself through her art. She taught Skylar everything she knew, pouring all her love into making up for the fractured family they had become. Yet no matter how hard she tried, there was always a distance between them, a gap Evelyn could never quite bridge. As Skylar grew older, she developed an insatiable hunger for freedom and a simmering resentment toward her mother's protectiveness. Evelyn didn't realize that in her attempt to shield Skylar, she had inadvertently placed the same kind of pressure on her that Richard had once placed on her. And now, with Lucas's arrival, Evelyn found herself being dragged back into the past. Lucas wasn't just Skylar's friend. He was a reflection of everything Evelyn had once longed for: freedom, understanding, and the feeling of being truly seen. But that realization terrified her, because Lucas didn't just remind her of her past pain, stirred emotions she had forbidden herself to feel outside. Lucas laughed loudly at something Skylar had said, sounded rich and unrestrained. Evelyn turned away from the window, desperate to push the image of them out of her mind. But the pain from her past and the turmoil of the present clung to her as persistent and raw as an unhealed wound. It lingered, simmering beneath the surface, ready to erupt at the slightest touch. And now Lucas was the one drawing it all out, little by little, piece by agonizing piece. That night the house fell into an eerie silence. Evelyn and Lucas were left alone in the expansive house, where even the slightest sound seemed to reverberate endlessly. Evelyn sat in her studio with the warm glow of the lamp casting a golden light over the incomplete painting before she tried to focus, to steady her hand. However, the brush trembled as her thoughts drifted back to the previous night, when Lucas's gaze had lingered on her with an intensity she couldn't explain. A knock on the door startled her, and she looked up to see Lucas enter the room without hesitation, as if the space belonged to him just as much as to her. "I didn't know you worked this late," he said in a low, smooth voice, his eyes narrowing with a curiosity that felt almost too intimate. Evelyn put down the brush, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I usually do. It helps me focus." Without waiting for an invitation, Lucas walked into the room with a faint smile. He stopped in front of the painting with his eyes and traced each brushstroke on the incomplete face. "It's the eyes again," he whispered, as if addressing himself instead of her. Evelyn scowled, her heartbeat quickening. "What are you saying?" Evelyn's throat tightened, uncertain of what Lucas was implying, but sensing that his words carried more weight than they seemed to in the room, which seemed to thicken with silence. Lucas pulled out a chair and sat across from her, leaning back as though he intended to prolong the moment indefinitely. She asked in a voice so quiet that it barely broke the stillness. Lucas turned to her, his smile fading and replaced by a seriousness that made the air between them feel heavier. When he finally broke the silence, he said, "Skylar talks about you a lot, but you're not quite what I imagined." Evelyn felt a twinge of unease, but she couldn't help but be curious. So she asked, her tone clipped almost defensively. Lucas raised an eyebrow as though her question was a challenge he intended to meet. But he said simply, but more vulnerably, "Like you're hiding something. A lot of some things." His words sliced through her like a blade, and she wanted to laugh and dismiss him to ease the tension in the room. But she couldn't. "I have nothing to hide," she stated firmly, despite the fact that her voice faltered, betraying her. The silence that followed was more unsettling than any words he might have said. Outside, the rain started to fall harder, its rhythmic drumming on the roof creating a steady backdrop. Lucas got up from his seat and moved toward the window, his silhouette framed by the night and the rain. He said lightly, as if making a comment on something much deeper than weather. Evelyn only nodded, unwilling to engage further. She tried to ignore how close he was, how his presence seemed to fill every corner of the room. Then he turned back to her, closing the distance between them. Evelyn gazed up into his eyes as he inquired in a low voice. But she waited, her defenses pressed against him. The question touched a part of her that she had long buried, and she was at a loss for words. "I don't," she said, her voice faltering as she spoke, seeming empty even to herself. Lucas moved in a little, his warmth now overpowering her. and the distance between them dwindled until it was nearly non-existent. "Are you certain about that?" whispered. In that moment everything else seemed to fade away. The rain, the lamp light, the rest of the world all dissolved into the intensity of his gaze. Evelyn felt as though she were being drawn into him, as though every hidden emotion within her was being reflected back at her, raw and exposed. She should have stood up, should have left the room, should have put an end to this. But her body refused to move. Lucas leaned closer, his hand brushing the edge of the table, a subtle but deliberate gesture that felt like an unspoken invitation. Evelyn's heart raced, and she knew she was standing at the edge of a decision from which there would be no return. "Lucas," she began, but before she could say more, his hand covered hers. The touch was light, barely there, yet it sent a jolt through her as if a current of electricity had passed between them. The emotions she had tried so hard to suppress surged forward, unstoppable before she could think. Lucas was leaning in, his breath warm against her cheek. And then it happened. His lips met hers softly yet insistently, pulling her into a torrent of guilt and desire she had long denied. The room fell into a silence broken only by the rain outside. Evelyn knew this was wrong. She should have stopped, but she didn't. She couldn't, because, although she knew deep down that this was the start of a fracture that would never be healed, the loneliness that had devoured her for so long found comfort in a way she never anticipated. Skylar stepped into the house, the door slamming heavily behind her, its sound reverberating through the quiet halls outside. The rain continued to pour in steady sheets, droplets clinging to her golden hair and shimmering under the warm glow of the living room lights. But Skylar paid no mind to the rain or her soaked clothes. She stood motionless, her sharp eyes scanning the space, and a strange heaviness filled her chest, a sense that something was wrong, unspoken yet palpable in the air. A faint laugh echoed from the far end of the hallway. Pulling Skylar out of her thoughts, she moved quickly, her damp shoes tapping softly against the wooden floor. Reaching the door to the studio, she froze, her hand gripping the door as her heart clenched at the sound of Lucas's voice, as low and almost intimate, carrying effortlessly through the stillness. "You know, Evelyn," he murmured, "this isn't just a moment." Skylar pushed the door open. She stood there, rooted in place, as if turned to stone before her. Evelyn and Lucas were too close in their proximity, speaking volumes louder than any words could. Evelyn turned her eyes wide, first with panic, caught like a thief in the act. Lucas remained where he was, only taking a single measured step back, his expression unreadable but far from apologetic. "What is going on with Skylar?" Voice was not loud, but it trembled with fury and pain, slicing through the air like a blade. Her question hit Evelyn squarely, leaving her unable to speak. Evelyn stepped back instinctively, her gaze dropping to the floor as though it held the answer she couldn't summon. Her silence only fueled Skylar's growing rage. "Mom," Skylar repeated louder, this time her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. "Answer me." Evelyn opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat, tangled with guilt and shame. Lucas, however, spoke up about, his tone unsettlingly calm. "Skylar, don't blame your mom. This isn't what you think." Skylar let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "Not what I think," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm and disbelief. She turned her fiery gaze to Lucas. "You don't even know what you're saying. What did the two of you do? Just tell me what happened." Her last words erupted like an accusation, shattering the charged silence in the room. Evelyn finally lifted her head, her tear-streaked face revealing a pain she could no longer hide. But still she said nothing, and in her silence, Skylar found all the confirmation she needed. "It's true," Skylar whispered, her voice barely audible, as though she didn't want to believe her own words. You betrayed me, both of you." "Skylar, it's not what you think," Evelyn said at last, but her voice was weak, lacking conviction. She took a hesitant step toward her daughter, her hands trembling as she reached out, only to stop herself. "This simply happened. It didn't happen because I intended it to." Skylar took a step back, her eyes burning brightly. "Are you kidding me? Even so, what does that mean? Do you mean that you unintentionally let the man I love to touch you? Is that what you're telling me?" Her voice shattered Evelyn like glass fragments as each syllable did. Lucas approached Skylar with an expression of regret, but she stopped him with a hand. "Lucas, don't say a word," she snapped. He froze, his face tensing as her anguish and rage weighed heavily on him. "You always urged me to be honest. to respect myself, to hang on to what mattered. And now look at you." Skyla turned to Evelyn, her voice shaking with barely restrained sorrow. But Skylar didn't care that he looked helpless. She had no space for pity. "Look at what you've done. You've destroyed everything, our family. My life." And her voice broke completely as she turned back to Lucas, her eyes brimming with tears. "And you, Lucas, you said you cared about me. You promised you wouldn't hurt me, and now look." The room fell silent suffocatingly, so Evelyn felt as though she couldn't breathe, as though the entire world had collapsed around her in that single moment. Skylar's gaze lingered on both of them. Her eyes filled with heartbreak, and finally, she turned and stormed out, her footsteps pounding down the hallway before the front door slammed shut with a force that seemed to shake the entire house. Evelyn stood frozen, her hands clenched tightly together. Lucas looked at her, but she avoided his eyes, unable to face the raw regret she knew she'd see there. "Evelyn," he said softly, his voice filled with something that sounded like an apology. But she shook her head, her voice breaking under the weight of her despair. "Lucas, you shouldn't be here anymore." He didn't argue. He stood still for a moment, watching her as though memorizing her face one last time, then without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving Evelyn alone in the studio. The sound of the rain outside continued its relentless rhythm. But inside, the silence became an unbearable storm, and Evelyn's mind sank into the nearest chair, her body trembling, her world in ruins. The next morning, the sky was a somber shade of gray, and the rain continued its relentless rhythm, drumming softly against the windows. Evelyn sat in her studio by the large window, her gaze fixed on the garden outside. The tree bent under the weight of the cold wind on their branches, swaying like weary sentinels. Inside, the silence were so heavy that Evelyn could hear the steady ticking of the wall clock, a rhythm so unyielding it seemed to echo the emptiness she felt inside. Skyla hadn't come home. There had been no calls, no messages. Evelyn had stayed up all night listening for any sound, any sign that the front door might open, bringing her daughter back. But all she had was silence. Lucas was also gone. He had left the house soon after the confrontation. And the night before he left, he had been slow and quiet, as if he had wanted to leave as little of himself behind as possible. However, his absence left a gaping void so large that Evelyn felt as though the house itself was shrinking, pressing in on her, suffocating her from within. The pale morning light filtered through the window, and as she made her way to the living room, there was an envelope on the coffee table. Its presence was unmistakable. The handwriting on it was so familiar that it made Evelyn's heart clenching. She picked up the letter with trembling hands, her fingers hesitant as she opened it, the words hitting her like a series of sharp, piercing blows, each one a pain she could not describe. "Mom, I require time. You've always claimed to love me. But love is more than words. You've shattered my confidence, which was the one thing that meant most to me. And I don't know how to regain it. I can't look at you and Lucas without feeling deceived. I don't dislike you. I just need some space. I'm not sure whether I'll ever be able to go." The letter slipped out of Evelyn's hands as she sank into the closest chair, tears streaming down her face, and her hands shaking as she clutched the piece of paper as if it were the only thing left of Skyla in her life. "I only hope that one day, when I return, we can find a way to start over." Skylar. Why should she blame her daughter? How could she expect anything else? Things had gone too far, and Evelyn knew she was the one who had pushed Skylar away. The days that followed were filled with a haunting stillness, and she tried to put all of her energy into her work, into the canvases that had once given her comfort. However, nothing could fill the void left by Skyla. She spent hours in her studio, staring blankly at incomplete paintings that her brush frequently left untouched. And Lucas was gone without a trace, leaving behind, with no sign he would ever return. In the end, she knew it didn't matter, because Lucas had made a mistake, a moment of weakness she would carry with her for the rest of her life. One morning, weeks after everything had fallen apart, a letter arrived, this time from Lucas, and when she opened the envelope, her heart stirred with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You don't deserve the suffering I've caused. And I don't deserve a place in your life. I'm sorry, not for what I did, but for making things more difficult. I won't return, not because I don't want to, but because I know that being around would only make things worse. Take care of Skyla." She needs you more than anyone else. You are her mother, and your love for her will be the thing that makes everything better." Evelyn put the letter down with a tightening ache in her chest and a faint thread of relief running through her grief. Lucas and Skyla were both gone, but she still had time to mend the fractures she had caused. As the months went by and winter arrived, she stood in her studio and stared at her most recent painting. A portrait of Skylar, her radiant eyes radiating out from the canvas with warmth and an unspoken distance. Evelyn didn't know if her daughter would ever return, but she would wait. As the snow fell steadily, covering the garden in pristine white, Evelyn closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Her life had been shattered in ways she never would have imagined. But she would not give up because love never truly fades, it just takes time to find it's on its way home again. She would wait until Skyla was ready to forgive, until she herself found the strength to truly atone outside.